Good morning. There are some truly fantastic things about being human. Seeing the world green up again with the spring, seeing the Cubs win a game at Wrigley. And one of my favorite things happened just recently when my nephew was visiting, and I showed him how to play the organ here. And he played the Moonlight Sonata on it, immediately followed by Thunderstruck by AC/DC. All of these are some of the best perks of being human. But there are some things about being human that are not so fantastic. They're things that are more painful. And brokenness is one of these things. Some of you will recognize this quote from a classic movie. "Life is pain, Highness. Anyone who tells you differently is selling something." And it's true. The human experience is filled with brokenness. Sometimes just hairline fractures that heal with time, and sometimes things that shatter every part of your existence. Now, experiencing brokenness is not a judgment of good or evil. It simply is. Brokenness happens to people who deserve it and people who don't. Sometimes we choose brokenness, and sometimes it happens to us completely out of our control. But either way, to be broken is to be human. This season, we've been talking about piecing it back together, and I can think of no better example than a Japanese art form that I've always found really beautiful, and it's called kintsugi. You can see a picture of it on the cover of your bulletins. It's when broken pottery is repaired, but rather than trying to hide the cracks to make it appear seamless again, instead the cracks are filled with a lacquer that is mixed with precious metal like gold or silver. So the result is a restored piece that is even more beautiful because its brokenness is highlighted and not hidden away. So then in its golden scars, you learn and you appreciate the history of its use. Often, the brokenness that we experience in our lives leaves a scar too. And just like physical scars, these emotional or spiritual scars can be tiny and invisible, or they can be huge and red and painful. And it's a very human impulse to want to conceal these scars from each other and even from ourselves, to pretend that we were never broken in the first place. We see it as a weakness or a failure, and it makes us less worthy or less valuable or less useful. I want you to just take a moment and look within yourself to identify one of those places that you have been broken. Is it something that you chose, like leaving a relationship? Or is it something that happened beyond your control, like abuse? Maybe your broken part is named loneliness. Maybe it's that your body is betraying you through age or illness. Maybe you're emotionally spent from taking care of everybody except for yourself. Maybe you're struggling to find faith that you've lost, or maybe you're just struggling to figure out who you are. It's another human impulse to isolate ourselves, to say nobody else could possibly know how I'm feeling right now. But I suspect that if we all named our brokenness out loud, if we compared our scars, that we would be surprised how many of us share the same ones. I don't mind sharing with you two major instances in my life where I have experienced extreme brokenness, because I know that many of you share similar experiences. But I also want to share about how eventually the lessons of kintsugi taught me to not just tolerate, but celebrate the places where my life broke apart. The first major brokenness I experienced was the breaking of my faith. I think a good number of you probably know that I was Mormon for the first 22 years of my life. And I lived in an area that was 90% Mormon. At the time, my entire family was Mormon. And so it would have been a lot easier for me to just maintain the status quo and pretend that I was still a believer, but I intentionally chose brokenness when I intentionally walked down that path. Now, exactly why I chose to leave the church is a long story for another time, but I will say that it was a traumatic process that was a lot of painful soul searching, and it took years and years. And it involved me losing most of my friends and a good chunk of my personal identity. And when that process had run its course, and I fully walked away from the Mormon church, I was absolutely sure that I was walking away from God and religion altogether. We see how well this has worked out for me. But as I gained some distance and some perspective from that trauma, I began to look for ways to celebrate the fact that I was healing from damage that I had thought was completely beyond repair. And one of the ways I did that was through my appearance. So the Mormon church is very clear about things that are and are not acceptable about the way you look. Among other things, there are no tattoos, and there are no unnatural hair colors. Now, not all members observe those rules, but it does feel like there's kind of an unwritten understanding that those who do observe those rules are the most devout. And I had seen faith leaders exclude people from the most sacred of spaces just because they had extreme hair colors. And so while I had always secretly wanted to have a fun color of hair, it was not worth being ostracized. So when I finally was brave enough to dye my hair for the first time, I looked in the mirror and it was like, oh, that's who you are. Now, it took me even longer to be brave enough to get a tattoo. In the Mormon church, it is said that tattoos defile the temple of your body. And I know there are certainly non-Mormon folks who feel the same way, and that is perfectly fine. But it was very explicitly forbidden in that faith. So when I got my first tattoo, it was this empowering act of defiance. I wasn't defiling my temple, I was decorating it. And I was doing it in a way that to me was sacred because I chose tattoos that were deeply significant to me. And so I was reclaiming my body.
I love you.
Now, the tattoos and the silly hair, these have become celebrations of my own history.
Yeah.
These are
Oh,
the
Sydney
gold
said that
mixed
she
with
loves you.
lacquer that
She's
show without
playing with
shame
Wally
the
as soon as
places
you.
that I was once broken apart. They are visible reminders to me that even though my whole identity was once
Hey,
broken,
stop putting it on mute.
I am whole again and I am more myself, not in spite of what I went through, but because of what I went through. But not all brokenness is something you willingly choose. Sometimes it happens to you. The second instance where I encountered extreme brokenness in my life was when, in 2018, my husband received a terminal diagnosis. When the doctors said the words stage 4 colon cancer to us, it was like a switch had been flipped. The damage was done. I would never be happy. I would never be whole again. And I accepted that. And even though he and I found ways to make the years that he had left beautiful and joyful in their own way, that innocent happiness would never return. And when he died at the age of 38 in 2021, one of the most surreal parts of the grieving process was that I still looked like a normal person on the outside, but the inside, I was a train wreck. I felt like Pigpen in Charlie Brown, but instead of this perpetual cloud of dust following me around, I felt like there was this black cloud of grief. And it was shocking to me that nobody else could see it because it was so real to me. But eventually, through the love and support of my family, and through all of you, and through a lot of therapy, I can honestly say that I have actually found my way back to happiness. And it's not that innocent happiness that I had before, but that doesn't make it any less real. I found meaning and purpose in what I went through by being able to be a listening ear to those of you who are caregivers or who are grieving your own losses. I keep Chris alive in my heart by leaning into joy, because now I know that any day could be the last, so I better make it a good one. My experience has become a beautiful scar that I'm happy to display so that others who are struggling know that healing is possible too. Now, there are many examples of brokenness throughout the Bible, and none is more powerful than Jesus choosing his own brokenness when he died on the cross. In our gospel reading that we just heard this week, Jesus says, "For this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life in order to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord." Jesus shared his radical message of God's love, knowing full well that he was choosing the consequences of publicly speaking that kind of truth under Roman rule. And if you remember our gospel reading last week, Jesus proudly bore the scars of his choice in his hands and his feet and freely showed them to the disciples. He said, "Look at my hands and my feet. See that it is I myself." He wasn't trying to hide his scars. He was using them to identify himself to his friends. And in today's epistle reading, John tells us how to apply the lessons of kintsugi in our own lives and in the lives of our friends and our neighbors. He says to us, "Little children, let us love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action." My friends, this is, to me, what church is supposed to be. This is God's love, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. We don't need to pretend that we've never been broken in the first place, because when we hide our scars, we are telling people around us that their brokenness is something that they should be ashamed of too. Jesus didn't hide his scars, and we don't need to either. Like that broken pottery repaired with gold, our scars are beautiful. They make us unique. They make us who we are, and they celebrate our history. We are all broken vessels, and we come to these pews or we come to this Zoom meeting to acknowledge that and to sit together in this brokenness, to fight against our human inclination to hide our scars, to make our brokenness both visible and beautiful, whether we chose it or it happened to us. To celebrate it loudly and proudly and say, "I have been broken. I know you have been too. Let's hang out together." This is why in the Holy Week that we just experienced, why we don't go from waving triumphant palms at Jesus' entry into Jerusalem and jump straight into "Alleluia, Christ is risen." We need to live in that brokenness of the last week of Jesus' life. We need to sit alone in Gethsemane and see Judas's betrayal. We need to make the walk to Golgotha. We need to sit with Mary at the feet of her dying child. We need to sit in silent anticipation of what we hope is to come, but is not here yet. The stories of our faith are filled with examples of brokenness, and we read them over and over to get comfortable sitting in that brokenness, to practice identifying it and accepting it in ourselves too. We piece ourselves back together with gold, and we live out God's love in ourselves and in the world, not in word or speech, but in truth and action. When we celebrate our scars, That is when we are making ourselves and our communities a safe and a joyful place for others to do the same. And isn't that the very definition of what it is to radiate God's grace, equipping all people to change the world? Amen.